Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share it.
Okay, perfect.
Maybe. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Um, why did you choose this one?
Okay, so we chose to do treatment of speech sound errors in cleft palate, a tutorial for speech language pathology assistant. And we chose this one for cleft palate because both of us currently work in the schools and we both are very interested in working with children, either staying in the schools or maybe like in an outpatient clinic. So I think this article um, really applies to the type of work that we want to do, that we do currently, and that we want to do once we're done school. And even it's specifically for speech sound errors in cleft palate, but a lot of the approaches that this study describes are approaches that we are implementing currently, and so it just feels relevant for us, even for clients without cleft.
Yeah, I like too that it's about like SLPAs and we like started there. We really know the supervising aspect of it too.
Yeah, like that's really nice too. It and I feel like as an assistant, like you can get practice implementing the approaches, which is really nice, but being able to like as you progress in the field and like are no longer an assistant, it's really cool to be able to like do the evaluation and see the errors and see why like those are your targets and why you're doing this specific approach. So I think it's really cool.
Yeah, and that you get feedback. Like when you're a speech therapist, like if you're working in a school by yourself, like no one knows what you're doing. So like if you have a supervisor while you're at SLPA, that's cool.
Yeah, I agree. And so Hannah, I'll let you go into a little bit of the background about this article. We kind of just described
Um,
it a little bit, but
the background was just about how cleft lip and palate is the uh, second most common birth defect in the United States, which we talked about in class. But it was just saying all that to say that many children that have cleft receive speech therapy, um, and that a lot of it's compensatory articulation errors that are seen, like glottal stops, nasal fricatives, and it listed a big chart, which is really nice to see that chart. Actually, I have it right here, um, where it lists a bunch of different common terms, but then also, sorry, it's taking forever to scroll. It listed a bunch of the errors down here. So that was really cool. It was a lot, the background was a lot of what we've already talked about in class, but it was really good to see it on here. But it also talked about how these errors have tremendous impact on not only their speech, but psychosocially for these kids. And so we want to make sure that we have the best approach so we can treat them the best way.
yeah,
I'm going to talk about the
definitely agree.
rationale.
Yeah. So, the reason that the study is needed is because, like we mentioned, the most common birth defect in the US is cleft palate, or the second most common is cleft palate. So, clients with cleft palate often receive speech therapy during their younger school years, especially once they've like had all the reconstructive surgeries. They really need that. They really need speech therapy at a younger age because, especially when they get older, they're going to have practiced doing it the incorrect way for a long time, and it could be more difficult to correct if you don't start it younger. But yeah, so most of the children who have cleft palate start speech therapy in their school years.
Yeah, probably unless they're in like a cleft team, like what you were talking about before.
Yeah.
Um, that's why they listed the objective. I just copied their objectives because I thought it was really laid out really nicely. We talked about that right before here. But just for them to talk about the speech intervention, various ways of the listing, compensatory articulations, evidence-based approaches, and recognizing the red flags during the course of treatment. So I really liked this article because it's very comprehensive about different approaches, why we use the approaches, how they relate to cleft, and like how we can kind of self-monitor.
Yeah, it was super cool. And then the level of evidence for this article is a level 5, so it's an expert opinion or clinical expertise. So really, this article is more of like a descriptive study. It's really just kind of describing approaches that would be appropriate for certain types of errors. So it kind of just gives you guidance on what approaches you should use for what types of errors.
Yeah, which I feel like level fives are not like talked about a lot, but like they're important for stuff like this because it takes what research has already been done and makes it more, I don't know, I feel like easier to read.
Yeah, for sure. And there were some other articles there for Cleft, but I really liked, even though that this one was a descriptive study and technically it's like the lowest level, I still feel like it's like super helpful and it was really relevant to what we do. Like I feel
Mhm.
like
Yeah,
both of us had talked about how we would keep this article like to refer back to, which is
yeah,
really cool.
definitely. This will be one in the toolbox.
Yeah, it'll be like a toolbox article. Yeah.
Um, and then obviously, like we picked it because it was with cleft palate, for those who have sound errors. But we talked about this inclusion exclusion criteria. We don't necessarily know if that like there was direct inclusion and exclusion criteria, but it was definitely about like kids with cleft and only those that have speech sound disorders, because obviously you're not gonna correct obligatory errors until they're done. Um, so I feel like we felt like that was the inclusion. And it was also talking about the SLPAs. So we feel like those who weren't SLPAs, it's not directly about, although like we as SLPs are going to use this article. So I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And then the intervention, we kind of went into depth a little bit here about the types of interventions that they talked about. Um, but the main two types that were described were the phonological approaches and then the motor-based approaches. So it's really nice, and like as a clinician or like an SLPA, you may have to like, or you definitely will want to consult with your SLP supervisor about which approach would be best based on like your client and their errors. You don't want to just like, oh, well, these are all the ones. Like, let's just pick one. Let's just try this. Like, let's just go through the list. You definitely want to consult about,
Especially with cleft, where they're like, it's very different than like kids without those craniofacial.
yeah, yeah, like, yeah, for sure. And so, um, the article described the phonological, I keep like collapsing that word together. The phonological approach is described where the contrastive approach. So you would have minimal pairs, multiple oppositions, and treatment of the empty set. And so the phonological approaches are for like the patterns of sounds that are in error. So with the minimal pairs approach, you would choose like a pair of sounds that are differing by one phoneme. So like if they're having an error with like P and they're saying a B instead, you would do like bat versus pat. And then you would teach the client or the child to discriminate between those minimal pairs and then have them practice saying it. And then you just provide the correct feedback to reinforce those.
I feel like
And
I
then,
like minimal pairs even as like feedback. Like even if I'm not using the minimal pairs approach, like if I'm doing like traditional, I might be like, oh, you said bad. Did you mean bat or whatever it was? Or you said bat. I thought you meant back. Like I feel like it's a
yeah.
good feedback approach too.
For sure. Yeah, like I know I have a couple kids on my caseload right now and they don't have cleft palate, but they do have like phonological errors and like having those two cards, like I have a client in preschool who is fronting. So for like CAPE, they'll say tape and then having a picture of each one and being like,
Mm.
"Oh, I heard this one." Like it's really auditory based. Like, "Oh, I'm hearing this." Like you're
Yeah,
saying.
self-correction kind of.
Yeah, yeah, like oh, you're talking about tape. Um, but yeah, so that's the minimal pairs approach, and then the multiple oppositions approach is when you have multiple phonemes that are substituted with one phoneme. So, for example, like if they had KS and like SH in air, they might be using T for all of those sounds. And
Mhm.
so you would use multiple words targeting the error. So, like tip, kip, sip, ship, like that. And you would present all the target words in therapy for maximum contrast. And then the last one that was described as the empty set approach. And so you would choose two sounds that the child does not have in their inventory at all, so like K and SH. And you would use non-words containing those two sounds, like kib and shib. Like those aren't real words, but they have the sounds in them that the child does not have. And then you would work on discriminating, then practicing the accurate production, and of course, provide feedback. Um,
I feel like empty set is good for a lot of cleft because of like they don't have a lot going on. But I don't know. I feel like empty set's hard because like as speech therapists, we want to be functional, so we want them to work on real words. So I struggle with that one, like implementing it because I'm like, I don't know. I feel
yeah,
like they want to work on
that's
real words.
That's a good point. Yeah, like how functional is it if you're not like we're so used to I've never used the empty set approach.
Yeah.
So I'm so used to like practicing words that like they actually will say.
Yeah,
Um
especially when they're so unintelligible that like we want them to be able to have some intelligibility.
yeah. Yeah. That's very true. That's a good point. Yes. And then the motor-based approaches that they described were the Van Riper approach, which we use that one a lot, especially for R. But I don't have any kids with cleft though, so it is cool to see how you would implement that with a child who does have cleft versus one who does not. But essentially, you just target like one sound in isolation, and then once they get that, you move into syllables, and then you increase the complexity of the task by going on making the utterances longer with the target word. And do you use that one too, Hannah? The Van
Yeah,
Riper?
I use it a lot. I use it a lot.
Yeah. Yes. And then let me go see. Oh, I lost my spot. Um